The sun blazed down on Sweetwater Creek, Texas, casting harsh shadows across the dusty Main Street as Daisy Beaumont clutched the crumpled letter in her trembling hands. It was 1875, and her life in Philadelphia had just collapsed along with her father's banking empire. The stagecoach that had carried her for the past grueling week finally rolled to a stop in front of what passed for the town's hotel. Dust swirled around her ankles as she stepped down, painfully aware of how her fashionable traveling dress pulled tight across her hips and bosom. Even after the arduous journey, she hadn't lost the curves that had been the source of endless ridicule from her so-called friends and family in Philadelphia society. "Miss, your bags," the driver called out, dropping her two remaining trunks unceremoniously in the dirt. All that remained of her former life, Daisy drew herself up straight, ignoring the stares of the townspeople. At 22, she was alone for the first time in her life, come to claim the only inheritance her father hadn't gambled away, a small millinery shop left to her by her late aunt. "Need some help with those, madam?" The deep voice startled her. She turned to find herself looking up at a tall, broad-shouldered man with eyes the color of the summer sky. His face was tanned by the sun, partially shadowed by a well-worn Stetson. Despite his rugged appearance, there was something gentle in his expression. "I can manage," Daisy replied stiffly, remembering how men in Philadelphia had mocked her behind fans and whispered about the banker's plump daughter. The stranger's eyes flickered with something like respect. "Never doubted it for a moment," he said with a slight smile. "Just thought I'd offer. Name's Xavier Prescott. Most folks call me Zav." "Daisy Beaumont," she replied, then immediately wondered why she'd given her name so easily to this stranger. Xavier tipped his hat. "Welcome to Sweetwater Creek, Miss Beaumont." With that, he turned and walked away, boots kicking up little clouds of dust. Daisy watched him go, a strange flutter in her chest that she quickly suppressed. She had no time for distractions. She had a business to resurrect and a life to rebuild. The hotel was modest but clean, and the proprietress, a widow named Mrs. Jenkins, showed Daisy to a small room on the second floor. "You're Hannah Beaumont's niece?" Mrs. Jenkins asked, helping Daisy with one of her trunks. "Yes, I've come to take over her shop," Daisy explained, Mrs. Jenkins nodded thoughtfully. "Been closed since she passed in the spring. Town's been missing a proper hat shop. The ladies have to order from catalogs or make the trip to Austin." She paused, looking Daisy up and down. "You don't look much like your aunt." Daisy felt her cheeks flush. "No, I suppose not." Hannah had been rail-thin and austere. Daisy had inherited her mother's curves, a fact her father had lamented often. "That's not a bad thing, dear," Mrs. Jenkins said kindly. "This is a new place. You can be whoever you want to be here." Those words stayed with Daisy as she unpacked her belongings and prepared for bed. Could she truly reinvent herself in this dusty Texas town, or would she always be defined by her figure and her father's disgrace? Morning came with the sound of roosters and the smell of coffee brewing. Daisy dressed in her plainest gown, a navy blue that did little to disguise her curves but was at least practical for the work ahead. She took breakfast downstairs, ignoring the curious glances from the few other hotel guests, then made her way to Millinery Lane. The shop was at the quieter end of the main street, a charming little storefront with a faded sign that read Beaumont's Fine Hats. The windows were dusty, and when Daisy unlocked the door, the musty smell of disuse greeted her. But beneath the dust and cobwebs, she could see potential. The wooden counters were solid, the display shelves elegant, and in the back room she discovered bolts of fabric, feathers, ribbons, and hat forms, everything needed to start creating. She rolled up her sleeves and began cleaning, determined to have the shop ready to open as soon as possible. Her inheritance included a small sum of money, but it wouldn't last long if she couldn't make the business profitable. Daisy was so absorbed in her work that she jumped when a knock sounded at the door. She opened it to find Xavier Prescott standing there, holding a steaming mug. "Thought you might like some coffee," he said. "Saw the light on early." "Thank you, Mr. Prescott," she said, accepting the mug with genuine gratitude. "That's very kind." "Just Zav," he corrected with an easy smile. "I run the livery stable down the street." If you need anything hauled or moved, let me know. Actually, Daisy hesitated, then plunged ahead. I could use some help with the larger shelves. I need to rearrange them. Xav nodded. Happy to help. Let me just check on a horse that's shoeing, and I'll be back in an hour. True to his word, Xav returned and spent the morning helping Daisy rearrange the shop to her liking. She found him surprisingly easy to talk to, without the artifice she'd grown used to in Philadelphia society. What brought you to Sweetwater Creek? She asked as they worked. The war, he said simply. Came west after Appomattox, couldn't go back to Virginia, too many ghosts. He glanced at her. What about you? Philadelphia's a long way from here. Daisy hesitated, then decided on honesty. My father lost everything in bad investments. When he died, there was nothing left but debts, and this shop my aunt left me. Xav nodded, no judgment in his eyes. Fresh starts are what the West is for. Over the next few days, Daisy worked tirelessly to prepare the shop. Xav stopped by each morning with coffee, and sometimes he'd bring lunch from the hotel restaurant. She found herself looking forward to his visits, to his easy conversation, and the way he never seemed to notice or care about her fuller figure. 1 week after her arrival, Daisy was ready to open Beaumont's fine hats. She'd created several new designs to display in the windows, using her aunt's supplies and adding her own flair. She'd always had a talent for design, though in Philadelphia, it had been considered merely a suitable hobby for a banker's daughter. On opening day, Daisy dressed in her finest, a deep green dress that accentuated her waist and brought out the gold flecks in her brown eyes. She designed a matching hat with a small pheasant feather. Looking in the mirror, she allowed herself a moment of pride. She looked well, regardless of what Philadelphia society might think. The bell above the door jingled throughout the day as the ladies of Sweetwater Creek came to see the new shop owner and her wares. Daisy was surprised and delighted by their warm welcome. Here, no one seemed to care that her waist wasn't as tiny as fashion dictated, or that her bosom was fuller than was considered elegant. Until late afternoon, when the bell jangled, and in walked 3 women who immediately reminded Daisy of the society matrons of Philadelphia. Their clothes were the finest in town, their manners carefully cultivated to showcase their superiority. So you're Hannah's niece, the oldest woman said, looking Daisy up and down with thinly veiled disdain. I'm Margaret Wilson. This is my daughter, Elizabeth, and my niece, Sarah. Pleased to meet you, Daisy said politely, though her stomach nodded. How? Interesting that you've decided to continue with the shop, Margaret said. It's such physical work and you seem so substantial. Elizabeth and Sarah tittered behind gloved hands, and Daisy felt her cheeks burn with the familiar shame. I find my figure gives me excellent stamina for the work, Daisy replied, trying to keep her voice steady. Well, we simply must see what you've created, Margaret continued, moving to examine the hats with a critical eye. Though I'm not certain someone so young could understand the sophisticated tastes of Sweetwater Creek society. For the next half hour, the 3 women examined every hat, making snide comments about the designs and pointedly discussing how certain styles would never suit someone of Miss Beaumont's proportions. When they finally left without making a purchase, Daisy locked the door behind them and sank onto a stool, fighting back tears. She'd been foolish to think she could escape the judgment and ridicule she'd faced her whole life. A gentle knock at the back door roused her. She wiped her eyes hastily and went to find Xav standing there, holding a small bouquet of wildflowers. Thought you might like to celebrate your first day, he said, then frowned as he noticed her reddened eyes. What happened? Nothing, Daisy said quickly. Just tired. Xav's eyes narrowed. Was it the Wilson women? Saw them leaving. Margaret Wilson thinks she's the Queen of England just because her husband owns the biggest ranch in the county. Despite herself, Daisy laughed. They were not impressed with me. They're not impressed with anyone, Xav said, handing her the flowers. Don't let them spoil your day. The rest of the town is talking about how beautiful your hats are. Daisy accepted the flowers, touched by his thoughtfulness. Thank you. Would you like to come in for tea? That evening set a pattern for the days that followed. Daisy worked hard at the shop, slowly building a clientele among the less pretentious women of Sweetwater Creek. Xav continued to stop by daily, sometimes helping with repairs around the shop, other times just bringing coffee and conversation. She learned that he'd fought for the Confederacy but had come to regret the cause. That he'd wandered west after the war, working as a cowhand until settling in Sweetwater Creek 5 years ago. That he could recite poetry from memory and had taught himself to play the fiddle. In turn, she told him about growing up in Philadelphia, about her love of design, and gradually, about the constant criticism she'd faced because of her fuller figure. "My mother died when I was 12, she confided one evening as they sat on the small porch behind the shop. "After that, my father became obsessed with finding me a suitable husband, but he said no proper gentleman would want a wife who couldn't maintain an 18-inch waist." Xav's expression darkened. "Your father was a fool." "He was trying to secure my future," Daisy said, though she'd had the same thought many times. "By making you hate yourself." Xav shook his head. "That's not protection, that's cruelty." Something in his vehement defense made Daisy's heart flutter. But she reminded herself that Xav was simply being kind, the way he was kind to everyone in Sweetwater Creek. As summer blazed on, Daisy's business slowly grew. She developed a reputation for creating hats that complemented a woman's features rather than simply following fashion. Women who had never felt beautiful in the latest styles from back east found that Daisy could design something specifically for them. But the Wilson women and their circle continued to snub her, spreading whispers about the odd, plump hat maker who was clearly desperate for a husband. Their words shouldn't have mattered. Daisy had heard worse in Philadelphia, but they stung nonetheless. One hot August afternoon, Daisy was closing the shop when Elizabeth Wilson and 2 of her friends passed by, speaking loudly enough to be overheard. "Poor thing, she must be sweltering in this heat, all that excess." Elizabeth mimicked an exaggerated figure with her hands, and her friends laughed cruelly. Daisy froze, the familiar shame washing over her. Then a voice behind her said, "Ladies, you're blocking the sidewalk." Xav stood there, his expression thunderous. The women scattered with muttered apologies. "You didn't have to do that," Daisy said, embarrassed that he'd witnessed her humiliation. "Yes, I did," Xav replied firmly. "They have no right to speak to you that way." "I'm used to it," Daisy said with a brittle smile. "You shouldn't have to be." Xav's voice was gentle but firm. "Daisy, do you know why I stop by every day? Because you're kind," she said simply. "Because from the moment you stepped off that stagecoach, I haven't been able to get you out of my mind," Xav said. "Your strength, your talent, your smile, everything about you draws me in." Daisy stared at him, certain she'd misheard. "But I'm not beautiful," Xav finished. "You're the most beautiful woman I've ever seen. Those curves they mock, they're part of what makes you you." He stepped closer. "And you fit perfectly in my arms." To prove his point, he drew her into an embrace, and Daisy found herself held against his solid chest, his arms wrapped securely around her. For the first time in her life, she didn't feel too big or awkward. She felt exactly right. That evening changed everything. As summer turned to fall, Daisy and Xav became inseparable. He took her riding in the hill country surrounding Sweetwater Creek, teaching her to appreciate the wild beauty of Texas. She taught him to dance properly, laughing as they practiced in the back room of the hat shop after hours. News of their courtship spread through town. Some, like Mrs. Jenkins, expressed delight. Others, like the Wilson women, made snide remarks about Xav settling for the plump hat maker. "Does it bother you?" Daisy asked Xav one evening as they walked along the creek that gave the town its name. "What people say? Not in the slightest," Xav replied, squeezing her hand. "Does it bother you?" Daisy considered this. "Less each day," she answered honestly. As October painted the countryside in gold and crimson, Daisy's business thrived. Women from neighboring towns began making the trip to Sweetwater Creek specifically to visit Beaumont's fine hats. Even Sarah Wilson sheepishly came in one day, away from her aunt's watchful eye, and commissioned a hat for her upcoming birthday. "I've always thought your designs were lovely," she admitted as Daisy measured her head. "Aunt Margaret is just set in her ways." Daisy smiled graciously. I understand, and I think I have the perfect design for you, something that will highlight those remarkable cheekbones. Sarah left with a commission for a hat and perhaps a slight shift in perspective. As Daisy's confidence grew, so did her relationship with Xav. They began discussing the future, dreaming of possibilities. Zav's livery stable was doing well, and he'd purchased land outside town where he planned to build a proper ranch someday. "I'd need a strong partner," he told Daisy as they sat on the porch of his small house one crisp November evening. "Someone with vision and determination." "And what about children?" Daisy asked hesitantly. "Would you want a family?" Zav's eyes softened. "I'd want nothing more than children with your spirit and heart." The words sent a thrill through Daisy. In Philadelphia, she'd been told repeatedly that her figure would make childbearing difficult, another strike against her marriageability. But Xav spoke of their future family with certainty and joy. As Christmas approached, Sweetwater Creek transformed. Garlands decorated the storefronts, and even the saloon put up a small tree. Daisy created special holiday hats, trimmed with velvet and tiny glass ornaments that caught the light. The town planned a Christmas Eve dance at the newly constructed town hall, and Daisy spent weeks designing her dress a deep red velvet that embraced her curves rather than trying to disguise them. She created a matching hat with a small sprig of mistletoe tucked into the band, a private joke between her and Xav. The night of the dance arrived cold and clear, stars brilliant in the Texas sky. Xav came to escort Daisy from her apartment above the shop, his eyes widening when he saw her. "You're a vision," he said, his voice rough with emotion. Daisy twirled, feeling beautiful in a way she never had before. "The dress turned out well, I think." "It's not the dress," Xav said, taking her hand. "It's you." The town hall was transformed for the occasion, with greenery and candles creating a magical atmosphere. Daisy felt every eye on them as they entered, but for once, she didn't mind the attention. With Xav beside her, she felt confident. Even Margaret Wilson approached, offering a stiff but civil greeting. "Your hat shop seems to be quite successful," she said, her tone suggesting this was an unexpected development. "Thank you, Mrs. Wilson," Daisy replied graciously. "I've been blessed with wonderful customers." As the band struck up a waltz, Xav led Daisy onto the floor. They moved together perfectly, as if they'd been dancing all their lives. "Do you know what day it is?" Xav asked as they twirled. "Christmas Eve," Daisy replied, puzzled. "It's exactly 6 months since you arrived in Sweetwater Creek," Xav said. 6 months that changed my life forever." The music slowed, and to Daisy's astonishment, Xav dropped to one knee in the middle of the dance floor. The room fell silent. "Daisy Beaumont, I've known since the moment I saw you that you were the woman I'd been waiting for all my life," he said, his voice carrying through the hall. "You're strong, talented, beautiful, and kind. Will you do me the great honor of becoming my wife?" He held out a small ring, a delicate gold band set with a pearl surrounded by tiny diamonds. Tears blurred Daisy's vision as she nodded. "Yes," she managed to say. "Yes, with all my heart." Xav slipped the ring onto her finger, then stood and pulled her into his arms. The crowd erupted in cheers and applause as he kissed her deeply. "You fit perfectly in my arms," he whispered against her lips, "just as you always will." They were married on New Year's Day, 1876, in the small church in Sweetwater Creek. Daisy wore a gown of ivory satin that celebrated her curves rather than hiding them, topped with a delicate lace veil she'd designed herself. Even the Wilson women attended, bringing a gift of fine table linens. After the ceremony, the entire town gathered for a celebration at the hotel. Toasts were made, cake was shared, and as night fell, the newlyweds slipped away to the small house Xav had prepared for them on the edge of town. "Welcome home, Mrs. Prescott," Xav said, carrying Daisy over the threshold. Inside, a fire burned in the hearth, casting a golden glow over the simple but comfortable furnishings. Xav had added special touches: shelves for Daisy's design books, a sewing table positioned to catch the morning light, fresh flowers on the table. "It's perfect," Daisy whispered, overwhelmed with happiness. That night, in the privacy of their bedroom, Daisy discovered the full wonder of being loved completely, without reservation or judgment. Zav's hands traced her curves with reverence, his whispered words of love and desire banishing the last shadows of doubt from her heart. In the warm afterglow, as they lay tangled in the sheets, Zav traced patterns on her bare shoulder. "You know what I thought the first time I saw you?" he asked. Daisy shook her head, curious. "I thought, there's a woman who could weather any storm," Zav said. "Someone real and substantial in a world of shadows." Tears pricked at Daisy's eyes. "And I thought you were the kindest man I'd ever met." "Not kind," Zav corrected gently. "Just smitten from the start." As winter gave way to spring, Daisy and Zav settled into married life. The hat shop continued to flourish, and Zav's livery stable expanded to include a carriage service. They began construction on a larger home on Zav's land outside town, planning for the family they hoped to have. In May, Daisy received a letter from Philadelphia, one of her former friends writing to inform her that everyone was simply shocked to hear she'd married some cowboy and expressing insincere wishes for her happiness. The letter was filled with thinly veiled insults about Daisy's figure and implications that she'd had to settle for less than she deserved. Once, such words would have devastated her. Now, Daisy read the letter aloud to Zav over breakfast, and they both laughed at the writer's transparent bitterness. "Poor Eleanor," Daisy said, folding the letter away. "She's still trapped in a world where a woman's worth is measured by the size of her waist." Zav reached across the table to take her hand. "Her loss is my immeasurable gain." By summer's end, Daisy had news that made their happiness complete. They were expecting their first child. Dr. Miller, the town physician, confirmed what Daisy had suspected for weeks. "You're in excellent health, Mrs. Prescott," he assured her. "Your figure is made for childbearing, contrary to whatever nonsense you might have heard back east." Zav was overjoyed at the news. He redoubled his efforts on their new home, determined to have it finished before the baby's arrival in early spring. Daisy began designing the nursery, creating a special mobile of tiny fabric birds and stars to hang above the cradle Zav was building. As her body changed with the pregnancy, Daisy discovered a new appreciation for her curves. Her fuller figure adapted naturally to the growing life within her, and Zav's admiration never wavered. If anything, he seemed to find her more beautiful with each passing month. Even Margaret Wilson, upon hearing the news, unbent enough to bring a hand-knitted baby blanket to the shop. "My mother made one like this for each of my children," she said, her usual hauteur softened by memory. "Every child should have something made with love." "Thank you," Daisy said sincerely. "This means a great deal." Margaret hesitated, then added, "You've proven me wrong, Mrs. Prescott, about many things. I hope you'll accept my apology for my earlier judgments." It was as close to a genuine apology as the proud woman was likely to offer, and Daisy accepted it graciously. The new year of 1877 arrived with a blizzard that blanketed Sweetwater Creek in snow. Daisy and Zav spent the cold days huddled by the fire in their new home, planning for the future. They decided to keep both the hat shop and the livery stable running. After the baby came, Daisy would bring the infant to work with her, and they would hire help as needed. "Our child will grow up knowing the value of hard work and creativity," Zav said, his hand resting on Daisy's rounded belly. "And knowing they are loved exactly as they are," Daisy added. On a bright March morning, after a night of labor, Daisy gave birth to a daughter they named Hannah. Grace Hannah for the aunt who had unknowingly given Daisy a new life, and Grace for the blessing she represented. The baby was perfect, with Zav's blue eyes and a dusting of Daisy's brown hair. As Daisy held her daughter for the first time, she marveled at how this tiny being had already changed everything. Zav sat beside them on the bed, his arm around Daisy, his eyes filled with wonder as he gazed at his wife and child. "She's beautiful," he whispered. "Like her mother." Daisy leaned against him, exhausted but profoundly happy. "We made a miracle." "You made a miracle," Zav corrected, pressing a kiss to her temple. "I just stood back in awe." As spring bloomed across Texas, the Prescott family settled into their new rhythm. Daisy brought baby Hannah to the hat shop where the infant became a favorite with customers. Xav expanded his business to include horse breeding, laying the foundation for the ranch they'd dreamed of. One evening, as the setting sun painted the sky in vivid pink and gold, they sat on the porch of their new home. Hannah slept in Daisy's arms, and Xav had his arm around his wife's shoulders. "Do you ever miss Philadelphia?" Xav asked. Daisy considered the question, thinking of the city where she'd grown up feeling constantly judged and found wanting. Then she looked at her sleeping daughter, at her strong, loving husband, at the home they'd built together. "Not for a moment," she said truthfully. "Everything I need is right here." Xav tightened his arm around her. "You fit perfectly in my arms," he said, repeating the words that had changed everything a year ago. "You and Hannah both." Daisy smiled, leaning into his embrace. "And you fit perfectly in our hearts." As darkness fell and stars began to appear in the vast Texas sky, Daisy thought of the journey that had brought her here from a ridiculed, insecure banker's daughter to a confident businesswoman, wife, and mother. She had found a place where her curves were celebrated rather than mocked, where her strength was valued, where she was loved completely in Xav's arms. With their daughter between them, Daisy Beaumont Prescott had finally found where she belonged. Not despite her curves, but with them a whole, beautiful woman who fit perfectly in the life she had created.